When you start sewing, there are loads of things you don't know how to do, and there are loads of things you suppose you're doing right and maybe you're not. So here are a few tips. And the first one is how to sew straight lines, and for that your machine has carved on the plate on the bottom a few lines with different width, so your edge goes straight. As long as you follow that line, you'll be sewing straight. The next one is the reverse lever. When you press that, the sewing machine starts sewing in reverse, and that allows you to secure your stitch when you start and finish your seam. Something that seems like a lot when you start sewing is sewing corners. And why is that? Because you think that maybe you have to stop sewing, cutting your thread and going back to sew another straight line. But you can sew all of it at once if you just keep your needle down, lift your press foot and turn your fabric. Then once you put your foot pressed down again, you can go on sewing, and that way you have it all in one. Sewing curves can make so many people nervous, and it can be simpler than you think. And there are two possible methods you can use. The first one is make your curve a straight line by pulling the excess material so the needle goes on a straight line. Very carefully, of course. And the other one is to start pivoting your material, turning it around your needle so you get that nice curve. Pivot, pivot, pivot. Gathers are so nice, and you can make them even if you don't have the gathering foot. And for that you're going to sew two straight seams parallel to each other with a long stitch. And when you finish your gathering, you can sew it to the material of your choosing. This is really good. I've realized now that I have to do it with two threads instead of one, with two seams. I always do it with one, but I think the second one is a good point of reference when you're sewing to the material of your choice. Of course, when you're going to hem something, it could be sleeves, neckline, the bottom of a trousers or a skirt or a dress. It doesn't matter, you want it to be as neat as possible. And by folding, you're adding a lot of different layers of material. And to avoid it being even bulkier, what you need to do when you get to a point where there's another seam in the middle, you have to open that seam so you don't end up adding even more layers to that hem, because if not you won't be able to sew it. Elastic bands suffer a lot from all that pulling, and to make sure they don't break, you need to sew it. If it's a narrow elastic band like this one, You need to sew it with a zigzag stitch, and if you had a wider one, you will need to do a square, sew a square on it, and then a cross. Once we have our elastic band loop, if we want to add it to something, for example a sleeve, what we will have to do is to divide it in quarters. First in half and then the other two, so that way it's balanced and you don't have a very gathered bit and a very straight bit on the other end. And if what you need to do with an elastic band is to put it inside a waistband, what you need is a safety pin.
Safety.
But of course make sure to pin the other end of the elastic band, because if not it will follow inside and you don't want that. Once you have the two ends out, you can sew it without any problem. And of course this is also useful if you have a hoodie or a pajamas or a sweatpant that has lost the cord. With a safety pin you can put it in easily, and it's quite fast as well. And these have been my basic tips, my obvious basic tips for beginners or for anyone really, because sometimes you don't realize what you're doing and all of a sudden you say,
That's done that way, I can't believe myself.
So if you have any more of these obvious comments I haven't mentioned, please leave them in the section down below. I would really appreciate it. It's really interesting to read different comments with different opinions on how to do stuff. And don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. I would really appreciate it. It helps the channel a lot and that way you don't miss anything. But anyways, if you want to stick around, I leave you some more videos about other tips or interesting stuff you might like.